Space Marine Terminators, genetically engineered warriors, veterans of the chapter, clad in thick ceramite plate, befitting of a war machine. Citadel have released many iterations of these iconic troops over the years, from some curious old designs to the familiar Indomitus pattern, rescaled and released along with the 10th edition Leviathan box set. But in this video, we're looking at these plastic Terminators. For my birthday in 1996, I asked for the new box game released by Games Workshop, Space Hulk, which, unbeknownst to me at the time, was its 2nd edition. In the game came 10 new plastic Space Marine Terminators, which I thought was cool since I had a Blood Angels army at the time, and there was no harm in adding some Terminators to them. Not that I asked for Space Hulk for this reason. It was a fun board game in its own right, though in hindsight, I prefer the 3rd edition, mainly for its incredible production value. Back in the day, I painted my models Blood Angels like on the box, though not as well as this, of course. And the bases were Goblin Green, just like the lush landscapes you would find on board a Space Hulk. Of course, now I am older and no stranger to the brush, I hope I can give them the paint job they deserve. There were 3 different variations with this range of Terminators. The one with the Stormbolter and Power Fist, the one with the Flamer, the Heavy Flamer, and the Sergeant with Stormbolter, Power Sword, Back Banner, and Fancy Eyepiece. Space Hulk came with 6 Stormbolter and Power Fist fellas, 2 Heavy Flamer chaps, and 2 Sergeants. They even came with stickers for the back banners. These models later got their own release, a box set containing 5 Terminators, 1 Sergeant, 1 Heavy Flamer, and 3 with Power Fists and Stormbolters. The plastic Terminators in question were certainly not the first plastic Terminators. That honour goes to the Terminators released with the 1st edition of Space Hulk. And it goes without saying that they were followed by a host of other plastic variations. And their release wasn't filling some kind of vacuum in 2nd edition. I remember metal Terminators being on the shelf, and in blister packs of my local GW back in the day, you could buy these. Shown off here in Ultramarines colours, which came with chain fists and an assault cannon, as well as the other standard armaments. You could of course opt for the silly Dark Angels Deathwing, which came with a Heavy Flamer and feathers aplenty. Or there was Space Wolf Wolfguard, again with a Heavy Flamer, but also wolf bits. And of course, you could supplement your squad with various weapon options available in blister packs. The first Terminator I owned was a metal Terminator armed with a Thunderhammer and Storm Shield, because hammers are awesome. I mean, it's in the name of the game, right? But blister packs also came with Terminators armed with lightning claws and cyclone missile launchers, to name a few. If there's an appetite for such weapons and their rules at the time, I'll cover them in another video. Metal Terminators at the time mostly came in 3 pieces: torso, left arm, right arm. Of course, some had additional accessories: storm shields, banner poles, and cyclone missile launchers, for example. But I'm going to be building and painting some of these plastic Terminators. Here's all the parts I'm going to be using to build my 5 models. They didn't come like this. They were painted Blood Angels beforehand, much like the bikes were before I painted them Imperial Fists. I stripped off their original paint job with BioStrip 20, and you might see some flecks of paint still present on the plastic. But I removed these later. I acquired these in an eBay lot, quite a lucrative one at that. The same lot, which came with the Predator I restored, and the bikes I painted a few videos ago. The previous owner didn't use glue when assembling these, which is great for me, since after stripping, it shows the studs still intact, studs which would be used to attach the arms to the body. I can also show you here the two parts which make up the torso, how they slot together, and how the resulting piece sits less than adequately on the legs. I suppose I could fill in this with green stuff or something, but it's probably not worth it, and I have a release schedule to adhere to. Before I glue them, I can show you the spinning as well. What a lovely feature this is. Before I start gluing, I take time to remove mould lines with my craft knife. Since there are several parts, there's quite a few to remove. Not as many as in contemporary kits, mind you, but enough to be a nuisance. Anyway, with that out of the way, I begin assembling the miniature using polycement. You can see here I am building the sergeant. The back of his torso is different from the others in that it has a place for the banner pole to go, but I shall be painting that separately, so I don't glue it on at this stage. I glue on the arms, positioning the sword in a thrusting pose, or as close as I can get to this given the limitations of the miniature. And here he is with some of his brethren ready for primer. As with most projects, I blue tack these to a length of wood before priming. If Mike McVeigh could manage without a specialist handle in 1993, then I can manage without one now. Now, Games Workshop is known for producing miniatures which do not require glue to assemble. This is the case in their board games and starter sets. Space Hulk 2nd Edition adhered to this pattern, providing players with a host of Gene Stealers and 10 new plastic push-fit Terminators. But before I continue with the video proper, I'd like to explain why I'm not a huge fan of them. This is just my opinion, of course. I want to draw your attention to the torso of these models. The torso came in two parts, a front piece and a back piece. These slotted together, without the need for any glue. They formed a socket around a notch on the legs piece. One feature of this was the ability to pose your Terminators, such that their torso could face in any direction. A few degrees either side of the centre seems fine. Turn it 180 degrees, and it seems a little ludicrous. But they're your models. You can do with them as you please. The arms are also push-fit, but this was also true of the metal miniatures before them. It's just they probably wouldn't stay on the metal miniatures as well as the plastic arms on these torsos. Again, there are some poses I would never use. I try to avoid the stone bolter at 45 degrees. It seems too orky for my disciplined Space Marines. Similarly, the power fist reaching forward doesn't seem menacing. On the contrary, he appears to be stepping in for a hug. And sticking with the power fist, I prefer the sculpting on the fingers of the metal power fist. My dislike for the plastic equivalent is hard to describe. You could say I can't quite put my finger on it. I suppose it pertains to the length of the appendage. The difference is subtle, but noticeable. And then there's the vents on the back of the Terminator. Contrast these with the metal sculpt, and the difference is significant. Then there's the way the torso sits on the legs. If you build these as intended, the Terminator seems to be rocking back a little, perhaps in an inebriated manner. Combine these with the other facets I have mentioned, and they just don't seem as menacing as the older models. I prefer the older metal sculpts, but that's just my opinion. Rant over. Anyway, back to the models. I primed them white to begin with, which is an ideal foundation in order to paint yellow, since these, like my bikes, will be Imperial fists. I started by mixing some paint on my wet palette, some Averland Sunset, with Vallejo dark sand, about 50-50. This is my base coat, which I apply all over the model, except on the weapons, and areas which I know will be black. The idea here is to lay down a subtle colour which will combine well with the yellow contrast I apply on top of it. As I said in my bikes video, please don't treat this as a definitive tutorial for yellow. Better ones exist for sure. This just works well for me and my skill level with the resources I have. When it's done, I thin down some Vallejo black with water and apply it to the back of the knees and the other joints where the under armour is showing. I also paint the sword, the stone bolter, and the special eyepiece black, since some of these will be metallic later. The sad bottom lip gets black as well. I've always thought this was a cool detail, a grimace on the helmet, a bit like a toddler not getting their own way. Here's the paint job so far. Next, some shading for the armour. I want the darkest recesses to be a shade of ochre. So I use an old paint called Vermin Brown, which is a bit like the new paint Tau Light Ochre. This paint is thinned with flow improver and goes in most of the armour creases, but I also paint some of this on the lowest point of each shoulder pad, and on the bottom of the armour on his lower legs. Other areas get this too, but the main principle is to apply this to the areas that would be most shaded. And here's how it looks after the first round of shading. On the big Termi badge and skulls, I paint some Vallejo tan earth with a dot of black mixed in, which will be the darkest colour on these areas. I now crack open the Imperial Fist contrast paint and paint this across all the armour panels. Coupled with the base coat, the result is a warm, smooth yellow shade, like a runny egg yolk.
Oh, it's just egg yolk, just egg yolk, just egg yolk.
When that is completely dry, I dilute some Vallejo Orange red with flow improver and paint some shading just above where the oak colour was applied. The aim here is to get a sort of orange gradient thing going, and when that's dry, I go in with another coat of the same mix, occupying slightly less area and focusing on those lower down on the model, or in deeper recesses. I'm not the best at glazing, by the way, but I'm improving. I wanted the shading on the helmet to have more contrast and definition than the rest of the armour, since there are more cracks and details on there. My quick solution to this was to apply some thinned Reikland Fleshshade, wicking away any excess with my brush. The edge highlighting wasn't too complicated, just some fine lines of dark sand, thinned with a drop of water, some plain old edge of the brush action on the sharp edges. I also painted on a few lines here and there to look like scratches. And while the dark sand is to hand, I mixed this with some tan earth and carefully painted all the raised areas of the shoulder pad icon, the skulls and the purity seals. At some point off camera, I applied the transfer to his shoulder. Nothing fancy. I tend to finish the armour and then apply the transfers, not necessarily waiting until the end of the paint job. Next, I took some dark Vermillion and paint this on the chest, on the purity seal, and on the hilt of the power sword. Later, I went back and highlighted all the red areas with some Trollslayer Orange. And the shade for these areas was some more Reikland Fleshshade. My favourite silver metallic paint is gunmetal, and I painted it on the various parts of the Stormbolter, on the helmet grille mouthpiece, and on the special eyepiece as well. I was tempted to go with some kind of gradient for the power sword, red or orange or something, but in the end I decided to just paint this gunmetal, but there'll be more details added later. The black sections needed some highlighting, so I used some black mixed with Thunderhawk Blue and painted this on all the edges of the Stormbolter and the raised parts of the underarmour. Back to the power sword. I mixed a little black with some gunmetal and painted this on the lower facing edge of the blade. Off camera, I painted the edges of the power sword with white mixed with a tiny bit of Caledor sky, and then I highlighted this further with an even lighter blue. On the flat part of the sword, I painted some thin blue lightning patterns, and then went over these with some white to make it look like the sword was crackling with energy. You can see here as well that the power field generators were painted with Caledor sky and highlighted with the same light blue I used on the energy crackle. Returning to the skulls and such, which I painted brown before, I paint some dark sand onto the uppermost areas, taking care that none of it gets into the recesses, although I could always fix this later with some brown wash. And with some white paint, I highlighted the very hairy edges of the icon on the shoulder pad, and on the other areas that I'd been painting the same colour as this. There was a gem on the shoulder pad too, so I painted this red and highlighted it with a little Trollslayer Orange. On the eye lenses, I used some light blue first, and when that was dry, I shaded it with a dark blue wash. The edges of the Stormbolter were highlighted with Fenrisian Grey, keeping to the corners and the sharpest edges. And a step I should have painted earlier, i.e. before the highlighting, a light glaze of Flashgitz Yellow on the top of the armour, just to finish off the gradient I had been painting. As with the bikes, these bases get a coat of Army Painter Goblin Green all over, sides and top, and later, a dry brush of dark sand. The first company of a Space Marine chapter is the Elite Company of Veterans. Terminator Armor is a rare and treasured asset, and only veteran Space Marines of the first company are able to use it. These powerful armoured suits are a physical embodiment of the chapter's fighting spirit, and are regarded by brother Marines as important artifacts in their own right. The left shoulder pad displays the stone Terminator badge, which is both a tactical symbol and a revered honour. Other honour badges are sculpted onto knee pads and greaves, or are painted onto the weapons. Mighty heroes and leaders of the Space Marines can also be seen wearing this armour. Captains, chaplains, and librarians, for instance. Models wearing Terminator armour have one of the best saving throws in the game, a 3+ on 2d6. This means they would only fail their armour save 2.77% of the time, if they were saving against weapons with no save modifier, that is. Fetch the las cannon, I suppose. Terminator Squads can be taken as part of the squad allowance of the army list. 315 points buys you a squad of 5 Terminators, one of which is a veteran sergeant. Their profile is the same as a veteran Space Marine. Compared to regular Space Marines, these enjoy an extra pip of weapon skill, ballistic skill, initiative, and leadership. Each model comes armed with a Stormbolter and Power Fist, and their Stormbolter can take advantage of the rapid fire rule, which allows them to fire twice per turn if they don't move. The Stormbolter comes with a Targeter, which grants an additional +1 to hit. One model in the squad can replace his Stormbolter with a heavy weapon, either a heavy flamer, assault cannon, or cyclone missile launcher. Any number of models may opt to exchange their standard loadout for either a pair of Power Claws or a Thunderhammer and Storm Shield. Alternatively, the Power Fist can be swapped for a Chain Fist, which aided in the rapid opening of tuna cans or enemy vehicles. If you're willing to pay a 50% tax on what you've already sunk into this squad, then they can be teleported into battle. This is effectively what we would now call Deep Strike. It was a potentially rewarding yet risky business. Teleporting off the board seems unlikely, but annoying since they have to wait until the next turn to try again. With every teleportation was the potential to scatter up to 2d10 inches. Rolling a double 1 on 2d10 means they are wiped out altogether, which could be very frustrating indeed. If they scatter into solid materials such as a building, you roll again from that point. If I've read this right, this leaves the possibility your Terminator squad could ricochet around the board from rock to hard place, bouncing off every cliff face, bunker, and rocky outcrop. I must try that sometime. If teleportation is successful though, you could use them in close combat or shooting in the turn they land. Although they don't count as charging on the turn they teleport in, if they are in hand-to-hand combat. All these rules make them a great thematic squad in my opinion. And if you, like me, are having skyrocketing blood pressure at the risks of teleportation, then you could always take another character with a teleport homer to slightly lessen the chances of failure or ricochet. It does amuse me somewhat that teleport homers are built into Terminator armor, because a model cannot home in on itself after all. Characters could take a Terminator armor-based loadout as well, from one option seen here in this list. As stated, they would also have a teleport homer built in, which could help if teleporting in another squad. And I'm suddenly reminded of Abaddon and his Terminator bodyguard, which teleport in at no additional points cost. One of many benefits of being a servant of chaos, I suppose. There was of course the issue of the banner. I couldn't find a suitable one online to download, so I chose to make my own. Using totally unsophisticated techniques on Microsoft Publisher, I smashed together some graphics I found online. A fist icon, a wreath, a crux terminatus, The banner was a standard Microsoft shape. I measured the banner pole to determine the dimensions of the banner itself, and after a few iterations, I was content with the result. I printed it out on standard printer paper, and then painted away. A kind of grimdark painting by numbers, essentially. I used Vallejo golden yellow for the background, tan earth and dark sand on the banner and crooks, Goblin Green for the wreath, and Vallejo black to tidy up the fist icon and line the edges of the banner. And of course, my own attempt at Gothic writing for the name, Squad Like Us. The pole itself was just the usual black and Thunderhawk Blue, with gunmetal and an Agrax wash on the crooks at the top. Then I stuck the banner pole in place for the icing on the cake. And here we have it. A squad of 5 Imperial Fists Terminators. Rubbish plastic ones from the mid-90s. Possibly the worst Terminator models released. Stocky, bumbling, even cuddly if you get the pose right. Not a patch on the metal Terminators that preceded them, but perhaps an evolutionary step towards the plastic kits we're familiar with today. Despite my misgivings about these models, I tried my best to make them look decent. You can't polish a turd, but you sure can roll it in glitter. Some old paint schemes have the power fists red and black. Similarly, the sergeant's helmet I've sometimes seen painted with red on instead of yellow. But I decided to just go for yellow all over. It seemed neater. Maybe I'll go back and change it in future, but these are fine for now. You'll see some variation in the paint schemes of each of these models. They're definitely not off the factory line, since I didn't use the same method throughout. But each Terminator is a unique and treasured relic of the chapter, and so I have reflected this somewhat in the painting, or that's the excuse I tell myself anyway. 3 of these were basically practice models for yellow, and what you see on the Sergeant is the conclusion of my experimentation. I even painted some of these before the bikes, so you get an idea how long I've been working on this. Speaking of bikes, here they are with the Terminators. Just 2 squads for my Imperial Fist so far. Again, why did I not choose blue? Aside from wanting to develop my yellow painting skills, these are part of a larger project which is slowly being realised. Another childhood dream unfulfilled until now. I wonder what unit I will add next, and which models I will choose. I guess you'll have to keep popping back to my channel to find out. Thanks so much to those people who sent me photos of their Terminators to include in my video. I've tried to include as many as possible. I like to showcase people's models as well as my own. Seeing these gives me ideas for future projects or variation on paint schemes I hadn't thought of. Perhaps these will give you ideas too. And if you like what I do, why not check out my Instagram? So I didn't do a song for this video. I wrote a poem instead. I was minding my business on my second tour of duty, when all of a sudden the air smelled kind of fruity. With a crackle and a fizzle and coruscating light, a teleporter beam activated to my right. There against the backdrop of a cratered battleground, 5 armoured warriors stood making not a sound. Paralysed in terror before their grimmest masks, I pondered was it me they sought to bring to task. The answer came too soon, as one his weapon raised, aiming at my comrade, who shook in horror crazed. The trigger pulled, the storm unleashed, bolt rounds leapt away, they struck my ally true, and at once the blood did spray. To arms the sergeant yelled, and our rifles we did bear, so fired did I full auto, and hit my target square. But futile 'twas the volley, which off his armour bounced. Then, burn, you traitors, burn in hell, my enemy announced. Our battle line did crumble, like a castle built on sand, as with power fists they engaged us in combat hand to hand. As if he was a rag doll, my squad mate they did pluck, they thrashed him and they smashed him, and his body they did chuck. But for me they had reserved a scintillating sword, crackling with lightning, a single hit he scored, my severed head now resting in a nearby ashen crater, the final sight my eyes did see, those bloody Terminators. And with that, I had better go paint some more miniatures. Take care, and thanks for watching.